It takes an altogether different kind of resourceful to look at a corpse and go, "Yar, that's treasure right there." Hello everyone, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. We are picking up where we left off last time with our Total War Warhammer 2 Count Noctilus Mortal Empires playthrough. If you're new here to the channel, go on down there, hit the subscribe button, and become a regular member here at the Gamer's Den. Or if you've already gone on ahead and done that, then go on down, hit the like button, and share the video far and wide. Also, leave a comment down below if you want to rename any of those fabulous units in any of our armies to whatever you may be suggesting. The only one we will not change is the Mourngul Haunter, Jim the Stasher, hashtag I crawl with Jim. But other than that, everything is free and clear and game for being changed. Now we are kicking things off here fighting Elven Wavemaker. Part of the Dragon Spine Privateers, we are going to put them in the ground. Well, rather than the ground, we are going to toss their bodies into the sea, let them soak a little bit, and then re-raise them and add them in as more crew for our dread fleet. So, today we were going to be talking about more history of the Warhammer world, and that's why I'm doing this again. I tried to record earlier, but my brain could not handle splitting the tasks between playing the game and actually covering the history of the Warhammer world. So this may be just what we do for these episodes now. So where we left off last time was the Great Vortex had been cast and put in place by Kalidor Dragon Tamer and several other High Elven Archmages, masters of magic of his age, and they bound their souls to running it, having discovered the different nexuses of magic, the geomantic webway and its various ley lines, and unbeknownst to them had help in reinforcing all of this from the Slann Mage Priests, and doing so drained magic from the world on an incredible scale, to the point that the greater demons, lesser demons, all of them could not sustain themselves, and mortal sorcerers found their powers drained, even the High Elves, although the High Elves retained an advantage in that they could channel the different winds of magic without much risk to themselves. So they were able to continue fighting using the incredible might of their dragons, of all these different forces, and were able to drive chaos away. But the land was not without its scars. The planet had seen massive volcanic eruptions, new mountain ranges thrown up where before there had been none. Lustria was an incredibly, unfathomably hostile place towards any other than the lizardmen who might venture there. And the beastmen were now in existence, wholly and totally mutated by the powers of chaos under the Dread Moon Morslib, and just horrific scarring. And like I mentioned before with the Lizardman histories, the Lizardmen didn't know what direction the Great Plan was supposed to go. But this was the world that the survivors found themselves in, and they managed to rebuild and bring themselves into an incredible state of prosperity, the High Elves and the Dwarfs in particular. Even the early men managed to start finding some semblance of a place in the larger order, in the grand scheme of things. But it was really the Elves and the Dwarfs who managed to really become ascendant. Even the Wild Elves in Athaloran and all of these other storied, ancient, hallowed forests, although they didn't spread like their High Elven cousins did, they still enjoyed a level of peace and prosperity that hadn't been known in some time. But it was one of those things that really wasn't to last. Things went well enough at first, and you had Maleketh, the son of Anarion, grow to be a powerful, strong, wise, and affable elven prince. He was actually instrumental in forging closer bonds between the High Elves and the Dwarfs, becoming an incredible friend to the Dwarven High King, and swearing upon the High King's deathbed that the two would remain close and have an incredible friendship, that those bonds of brotherhood would stay in place for all time, and Malekith swore to this. But the issue was that the High Elves needed to select who the next leader was going to be, and Malekith's supporters, those who had fought alongside his father Anarion, wanted him to become the next Phoenix King. It only made sense, to continue it on through that patrilineal progression. He was Anarion's son, so of course he was a natural fit. But not everybody thought that they should just immediately go to the son of a warrior to keep things moving forwards. So the Council of Elven Princes opted to elect Belshazzar to the throne to become the next Phoenix King. And Malekith was the first one to swear fealty to him. And knelt before him and ensured a peaceful transition of power. Now, Morathi, Malekith's mother, the second wife of Anarion, pitched an absolute fit over this, but there wasn't much that she could do, and in fact would end up being arrested later on for leading debauched cults that were starting to swing in a direction that could be almost considered Slaneshi, but they were also leaning in a direction that really leaned towards Cain, the High Elven god of murder. So she was arrested, and Malekith helped in arresting her and bringing her before the council, before the princes, before Belshazzar, and she was imprisoned in a tower. It was in Malekith's lands, the lands of his people, but she was in prison. So this ingratiated himself further to the High Elves, to these various princes. And it was around this time that, during a council meeting with Belshazzar, that Malekith made his move, poisoning Belshazzar's wine and slaying the Phoenix King there. And then assassins and other retainers that he had on hand jumped into the scene and began slaughtering the High Elven princes as he made his way to the chambers with the flames of Asurion, the patron of the High Elven pantheon. He is the chief deity. And he strode into those flames, expecting to be crowned the next Phoenix King. To be broken down and reborn from those ashes into the closest thing to a god on earth that had walked here since his father. But instead of being reborn, he was just burned and consumed by the flames. The flames were just devouring him, and in his pain and terror, he threw himself out of them, and his retainers carried his corpse and raced it back to Morathi, who, along with some of the greater smiths and other mages still alive, were able to encase his body in his signature iconic armor. That blackened plate armor with that gold trim, that's what helps to keep him alive and helps to keep the flames of Asurion at bay. And this sparked the High Elven Civil War. And eventually the Dark Elves were driven from Ulthuan and were driven to the New World. But Malekith was a creature of plans and plans and plans, and over time he devised a way to weaken the High Elves and make an opening for himself and his newly christened Dark Elves, or Druki, and they would be able to march upon a weakened Ulthuan. He sent his soldiers around Ulthuan and into the Old World, moving from the High Elven colonies in the Old World, and began raiding and destroying dwarven settlements, leaving plenty of evidence that the High Elves were the ones that had done it. Now, the High Elves, in their arrogance and also wanting to maintain an image of strength, didn't let anybody else know that they were undergoing a civil war. In fact, they had just ended up crowning a new king after Belshazzar was killed and the Dark Elves driven off. They crowned Calidor II as the new Phoenix King. Now, the Dwarfs, pissed off, but, remembering their oaths of friendship, sent emissaries. The High King of the Dwarves at this time was Gotrek Starbreaker. And he personally sent his own diplomats to the High Elves to be like, what the hell? They demanded to know who had done this, demanded recompense, and demanded the heads of those responsible. Calidor II just went, no, we're not stooping down to your level. We're not doing that. In fact, and he snapped his fingers, and his Phoenix Guard restrained the ambassadors' guards and retainers, held the ambassador down, and shaved his beard from his body, from his face, shaved the hair from his head, and sent him back to the High King. Now, this was a mark of shame, and the diplomat ended up taking the Slayer's Oath. Essentially, losing his beard was such an incredible dishonor that he basically considered himself to be dead in order to preserve his own honor and preserve his family's honor. We can talk more about what the Slayer's Oath is another time. But this was a grievous insult. This was one of the king's diplomats. You don't touch a diplomat to begin with, but this was somebody ordered directly by the High King to represent him, to be his voice in the High Elven courts. And the High Elves did this to somebody who they were supposed to be sworn friends and sworn brothers with. This was a grudge of beyond grudges to go down in the Book of Grudges, and he mobilized the entirety of the Karaz Angkor to war against the High Elves, and began smashing their settlements, taking their places from them. So Calidor II, rather than trying to explain what happened, mustered the High Elves and marched off to war. And some sources list the estimated strength of the High Elves and the Dwarves in the millions. I don't know that the numbers were quite that great, but suffice it to say, tens upon tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of High Elves, of Dwarfs, went to war with one another and began slaughtering each other. And then Calidor II, as these great throngs of dwarves, as these columns of High Elves were fighting and warring with one another, all up and down the old world, Calidor II would actually end up finally slaying the son of King Gotrek Starbreaker, Snorri Halfhand. And in doing so, heightened the Dwarf King's grief and fury even higher. And to say the Dwarf Lord was furious is to put it mildly. Came to a point where the two actually would end up eventually meeting in single combat, warring with one another. These nigh-on deific beings just warring with one another, hacking, slashing, crashing with hammers, maces, spears, and swords, till finally Gotrek Starbreaker would crumple in the chest plate of the Phoenix King, knocking him to the ground, causing the Phoenix crown to fall free from his head. And in a moment of panic, Calidor II started to beg for his life, but Gotrek Starbreaker heard none of it. He hefted his hammer, took only a half a second to look at the fallen elf before caving his face in with a single strike. Having smote his enemy, taking his life as part of the grudge, he looked over to the Phoenix crown, picked it up, and gave himself a sad half smile as he took that as recompense to settle the grudge and marched his throngs home. This left the elves in utter disarray and chaos, to the point that the dwarfs were actually able to get away from them in relative safety. And it was only the urgent calls to come back to Ulthuan that would draw the High Elves home and end any dreams of any possible pursuit or recovery of the Phoenix Crown, because Maleketh, the Lord of the Druki, had marched upon Ulthuan, while their forces were split, divided, and now severely, heavily crippled just throughout these years and years of warfare. The Druki were now marching through Ulthuan and killing and subjugating and slaughtering more. Not just slaughtering, but also enslaving some incredibly unlucky survivors. And so the High Elves retreated, falling back from their colonies, abandoning them entirely to later be rediscovered by the Dwarfs or the men who would come later to settle these lands. And so the High Elves went back to the island of Ulthuan to defend their home from the predations of the Dark Elves and prevent them from gaining any further ground. So that pretty much more or less sums up and concludes the War of the Beard right there. Just absolutely an intense conflict, and you think and you imagine how many hundreds of years, maybe even thousands of years, some of these elves had in experience for warfare, having had to fight the forces of chaos for so long, for so much of their lives. And even if they didn't have direct combat experience, those with direct experience would be able to pass it on to those new recruits. They would have as close to first-hand experience as you could possibly hope for, the best sort of training possible to make them ready for warfare. And then the dwarves and their long martial traditions as well, being a stout, sturdy people, solidly built, and also utterly unyielding, particularly once an oath has been sworn, once the oath stones are down. The lord that casts down the oath stone will not move from that spot until combat is finished, or they move forwards. There is no retreating past the oath stone. And just think that this occurred as the elves descended upon them, bringing their dragons, bringing their giant hawks, their griffins, their mages and wizards, the sword masters of Hoeth, the dragon princes, riding their furious mounts, not just dragons but horses as well, powerful destriers that the elves had spent centuries breeding for war. And you imagine just the utter devastation, the tactical precision, and the might being levied around. And bear in mind that the dwarfs of the Warhammer world don't practice magic as the other races do. The dwarfs view magic as something as wild, unpredictable, untrustworthy, something that they do not put stock or faith in. Instead, they had learned a workaround from their ancestor gods, creating runes, specific runes that would capture specific forms of the winds of magic and apply them to a set purpose. And these runes, once carved onto armor, once carved onto weapons, tools, they add in extra functions, make those weapons and implements something more than what they had been previously. Even more powerful are the Anvils of Doom, ancient anvils crafted by their ancestor gods and taught to the greatest runesmiths of their age. To forge an Anvil of Doom is to be an order of magnitude of mastery that is nigh on unheard of in the Karazankor today. For when a runesmith brings an Anvil of Doom to war, brings it to bear against the enemies of the dwarf kind and the Karazankor, when they strike it, mighty thunderous power comes roaring out, crashing into the ground through the lines to smite the enemies of all dwarf kind, to erase grudges from the book, to avenge all of those wrongs done to the dwarfen race. I mean, rune lords and their rune magic are just utterly terrifying, and when they activate it upon the battlefield, they further harden the armor of the dwarves. They can dampen the magical effects that their opponents would otherwise have access to. They take the edge off of that might and close off one of the areas where they can be somewhat weaker in many regards. They can't project fireballs, they can't summon comets from the sky, but goddamn, they will load up a cannon, level it at you, and shoot you from so far away. Dwarven artillery is second to none. The elves have their bolt throwers and maybe a few other contraptions, but nothing compares to dwarven organ guns, to dwarven cannons, to their, what is it? The troll hammer torpedoes that they can fire. And the armor and armaments that they can craft. Second to none. The only reason the High Elves can pull any kind of ahead of the Dwarfs in this craft is because they can live for a few centuries and have access to a wider variety of magic. But still, absolutely incredible. And so, as Gotrek Starbreaker led the Dwarfs home, he thought he was leading them home into a time of peace and rebuilding and refortification. And maybe he would have been right had calamity not struck the world. Something caused the earth to quake and shake at its very foundations, for tunnels and caverns that had stood for centuries to collapse, for the great underway, the massive highway that connected all the dwarven holds and mines and castles and mountain homes together, began to fracture and crumble. Untold thousands were buried alive in the earth. Many more were just simply crushed or dropped into the caverns below, or trapped as new waters came flooding in and drowned in that deep darkness beneath the earth. And mountains erupted, sending lava flooding through so many ancient holds. And for the dwarves, this was an unprecedented calamity that touched so many of their homes, and they were already left vulnerable, and this now opened up the underway into new tunnels, into new caverns that had never been found, explored, or discovered up to that point. So, absolutely a moment of devastation on top of another moment of disaster that had already happened. And things were only about to get worse from there, as new horrors, new terrors began to surge upwards from underneath, from through those darkened tunnels, as horrific, terrible, gaunt, greedy, ravenous, slavering rat men began pouring out, and now the Skaven made themselves known to the world, or at least to the dwarfs, as they surged out through the tunnels into the holds and began slaughtering, eating, and devouring everything and everyone that they could, claiming as much as they could. Now, perhaps the dwarves might have had a chance. They might have still been able to hold them off, for the might and skill of a single dwarf still outpaces and outmatches that of even the greatest of Skaven. They would be able to outfight them, especially with the armaments that they have at their disposal. But from above, around these weakened gates, came the tides of greenskins as well, egged on by the machinations of the Skaven. Great hordes of goblins, of orcs, came pouring up against the gates, battering down those walls that were sufficiently weakened, and they began driving in from the surface, while the Skaven poured in through the lower tunnels and through the mines. Where the dwarves thought themselves strongest, they now found themselves horribly and unapproachably assailed, unstoppably assailed, rather. Just even remembering all that, just thinking about it, talking about it, just go, oh god, that is horrible. That's a lot. So, the dwarves would have that fight on their hands. The elves, the continent of Ulthuan was untouched. The magics laid down there by the Elven Pantheon and all of their spellcasters would keep Ulthuan safe from the touch and the corruption of the Ratmen. To date, no Ratmen have ever set foot on Ulthuan, and the High Elves were actually able to drive out Maleketh. They were able to prevent him from taking hold in Ulthuan, and as the elves didn't have to worry about much else at the time, unlike the dwarves, they were actually able to enjoy, if not outright peace, at least the kind of stability they'd need to replenish themselves, though this is around the time that the elves started noticing that, well, their numbers are getting depleted real bad, and they are not blessed with fecundity like the other so-called lesser races were. So the elves were presented with new problems as a race in decline, much like the dwarfs were. This has ended up being a lot to remember and cover. I might have to give myself a little bit of a break from that. It's definitely interesting. It's odd recounting these things. I thought I would have been better at this, and as much as I've steeped myself in the lore for Warhammer, there's just so much to remember at any given time. My brain just stops and kind of racks itself a little bit, trying to draw up and conjure these different things, these different memories, bringing them out of that data vault that's located somewhere in my mind. And I can see a lot of these things, and there's lots of neat, different other little stories. The thing is, it's all so disjointed that I could talk about this or talk about that. You just saw how I drifted off from the High Elves, talking about Gotrek Starbreaker leading the Dwarves back to the Karaz Angkor to rebuild and refortify themselves, only to end up being struck with disaster. And we're talking about an interconnected global history, probably one of the better done fictional world histories that I've gotten to read in ever. I don't know how to rate or qualify that, but everything's interconnected, because the great vortex that Kalidor and the other High Elven Archmages conjured wouldn't have been possible without the geomantic webway, which was laid down by the old ones, and they tapped into it, built rune stones and guide stones to help secure and channel those energies and keep the vortex spiraling in place. But even still, that would have failed had the Slann Mage Priests not realized what was happening and lent their arcane powers to that process as well, and they were able to do so because the elves were, in their own method, tapping into the geomantic webway. And so the Slann, being inherently tied to the geomantic web, especially with the way that their cities are laid out, they were able to detect this relatively easily and dedicate their powers to it to help ease the tide of chaos. So those were several moments interconnected right there. And then, of course, you have the dwarves. The dwarves were fighting the hordes of chaos as well. And in fact, several dwarves ended up being caught out in the storms of magic. The dwarves are already naturally resilient to magic and the warping, corrupting effects of chaos. But the ones that were out, the ones that were not secure within their holds, within the mines, the ones who were trying to go out, explore, and settle during the time of the collapse of the polar gates, when a great storm of chaos had erupted out, even they were subjected to such incredible levels of magic that they were unable to resist. They were unable to stave off the corrupting influences, and they prayed to their ancestor gods, to all of them, to Valea, each of the 3 dwarven ancestor gods they had reached out to, and found no salvation. So they began crying out for other beings, other figures to save them. And much to the horror of the rest of dwarven kind and many others who would come along later, they found one. They found the great bull god that would save them, that would corrupt them and lead them down into darkness. And they would end up becoming what we now know as the Chaos Dwarves. Those dwarves dedicated to dark magics. And unlike their cousins, they are actually capable of using magic. And they have great works of artifice, but unlike their more conservative kin, they are more than willing to experiment. They will do and commit all kinds of corrupted, depraved acts in order to achieve their goals, in order to create a deadlier machine. Demon-infused cannons that use living beings' souls as ammunition. The only thing keeping them from continuing to fire is the potential that they'll run out of bodies at some point. And these cannons are alive as well. And if they break free of their chains, of their moorings, they'll actually roll out across the fields and slam into whatever living beings are nearby, crushing them under their great spiked wheels. They're utterly terrifying things. But yeah, that's just, again, another example of how interconnected all of these things. So many things are happening simultaneously throughout all of this history, all of these things going on. So all of these different races will have input and different effects as these different mutations and changes happen. So like I said, it's a lot to remember, and it's really, really easy for my brain to get lost and go wandering down these rabbit trails. I mean, again, it's kind of fun. It makes it so that I can learn a lot, have that wider perspective, but that also makes it a little bit harder for me to zoom in and focus on a particular train of thought because, well, there's this, well, then there's that, oh, and this happened right after that, oh, and speaking of that, here's this thing over here that's kind of related, but not really, and yada, 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 on and on and on, you know. What wonderful ADHD brains. Yeah, but that's part of what's made this so fun, is just gaming in general, tabletop gaming. Reading all about these different settings, these worlds, these histories, these lores, and Warhammer, old Warhammer, Age of Sigmar, I've got a little bit of a split opinion on, split feelings on it, but for the old Warhammer world, it's one of those things I like. They have one of the better stories, I think, for why more powerful magics aren't available, especially after all this time as people learn, develop, advance, and grow. Why hasn't magic gotten stronger? It's because of the Vortex drawing off the energies of chaos that fuel magic, that are magic, that spellcasters would otherwise be tapping into. And so that's why they can't match the artifacts of old. They can't create anything stronger. They can only create weaker replicas, because these things were made at a time when magic was in a greater abundance and there was more power to be wielded and used. So that does a lot to... That does a lot to really cement a lot of reasonable, consistent, logical, however you want to dice that particular subject. It makes a consistent narrative in their world, and I think that's a lot of fun. I really enjoy it when stuff is done like that. I like better reasoning than, just because. So, let's, I mean, okay, DM is the DM, the rules are the rules, that it is what it is, but I'd like a reason. I'd like to know why. And particular trait of mine ever since I was a small child. I don't just like to know the thing, I like to understand why the thing is the way it is. Many frustrating moments for my parents. Well, not frustrating. Sometimes. Sometimes it was cute, sometimes it was fun. But again, I'm getting off subject and going down a rabbit trail here when I should be talking about Warhammer things. Though, honestly, looking at all of this, watching these ogre bulls on their mounts just go thundering into those undead artillery lines, watching my gunners cut down these depth guard, these halberdiers, it's just amazing. The Vampire Coast have been so much fun to play as. I'm actually really looking at continuing past turn 100 on this. I do want to go back and finish out the Snicketch campaign for the Skaven, but this has been altogether fun in a whole lot of different ways. Not just the regularly winning aspect. I don't mind losing either. It's just the play style is very different. Like, it's only been so recently that I've captured and claimed any more territories other than just that one along the Vampire Coast, along Lustria. Like, and there was a reason for that, and it's because, as you can see, as you have seen, taking these territories, these regions, I've now invested in them. I've now developed them to try to develop my power and economy, but that also means now that I've invested in it, I need to defend it, so I have to invest in more armies, which means less income, which, thank God, I went as long as I did without taking any more territories and getting income stuff set up along all those other ports to boost all the money I was making, because holy crap, these Vampire Coast armies get, well, in some ways kind of spendy. It's nice to have some easily replaceable meat shield units, but we are definitely fragile and definitely need to soften things up before they get close to us. We have all the artillery necessary to do that, and Mourngulls do a ton of damage to infantry, especially when you get them flanking real nice. And man, those handgunners, 91 kills, 41 kills, 114 on those Mourngulls. Jim the Stasher got 36 alone. And then all my artillery pieces there, that's just a crazy amount of damage. And then those ogre cavalry mercenaries that I have there, great addition to this force overall. There's not a lot of great flanking units. There's those deck droppers, deck dropper handgunners. They do a lot for my army, being able to fly around, flank, shoot people in the back where they have less defense against missiles, and their armor piercing to boot. That's great, and also really handy for harassing and dealing with enemy artillery, but still not quite as good as having some decent cavalry. And the Bretonnian cavalry, my god, having to deal with those. You'll see that upcoming in a little bit here. Another massive attack on Fort Bergbruss. And it's just an incredible amount of cavalry. Oh my god. Really happy, really glad that I didn't have to fight that on an open field, because an open field would have just spelled a new death all over again for all of my undead units. Which, by the way, go ahead and go on down to the comments and leave any unit name suggestions down below.
Follow, shipmates!
I may have to find another or possibly better way of doing this. It might just have to be shorter episodes where I do the history lesson stuff for the Warhammer world, just because, and keeping my focus on it and conjuring up all those different details is tricky sometimes. Especially since by the time I'm getting around to a lot of this stuff, I'm not far off from having to try to catch some sleep, and I am trying to be so much better about sleep. But you did not come here to listen to me whine and ramble about my life or my sleep patterns. No, my friends. We are here to watch me kick the crap out of some Bretonnians, to beat the snot out of wayward Vampire Coast pirates, and to trample the Empire into the dirt. But of course, currently, yes, what we are doing is going after Bretonnia, because Coron has confederated with more Bretonnian lords. They've expanded their army, their forces, their income, and they are now threatening the Blackstone Post. As I said, taking more territory means having to defend more, means more armies needed, and with as many different factions as I've gone out of my way to upset and make war upon, I have a lot of enemies that I need to work my way through and begin destroying. And oops, Estelle Gordy could not make it to Castellon the Devoted. But that's okay. The Blackstone Post will survive that. And just figuring out what we're going to do here. Really glad I improved those walls there, because that makes things even harder for them. Can't sally out because that leaves the terrain as hills and leaves us vulnerable to that. My God, I kind of forgot that there was that much cavalry. That many questing knights, knights of the realm, knights errant. That's a lot. And then they're supported decently with bowmen, like bowmen to help shred my undead units that don't have the best missile defense. Saying we don't exactly have a whole lot of shields there, or a ton of armor in a lot of instances, so they would rip apart my meat shield infantry really fast. Definitely not an ideal situation in any way, shape, or form. All those dark elf factions, the Druki, dedicated to Cain, god of murder. And Cain's sword is half the reason the world is actually, about half the reason the world has ended up in the mess that it's in. Because without the sword of Cain, without Widowmaker, there's no Maleketh. Potentially, there's also no Anarian. Sorry. There's no Anarian who's capable of defeating the 4 legendary greater demons of each of the chaos gods. There's no defeating Kabanda. There's no defeating the great unclean one. There's no defeating Nakari. There's no beating, what's his name? The two-headed Lord of Change who sees the past and sees the future, but cannot see the present. But anyways, he defeated a champion, legendary, unique bloodthirster. And the same for all those other greater demons. He defeated all 4 of them in, I was going to say single combat, but he took all 4 of them on at the same time. And it was Nakari that gave him the greatest trouble, because Nakari was the fastest out of all 4. Not to say that the other 3 weren't dangerous to Anarian, didn't inflict their damages on him, but that just magnified the danger of Nakari all the more, and actually caused Nakari to swear revenge against the blood of Anarian. So later on in High Elven history, he would go on to track down anybody that was descended from Anarian. So, poor High Elves, 5,000 years separated from Anarian. Never met the guy. May have not even known that much about their parentage, depending on how things may have ended up going. And he goes on to begin slaughtering them, making his way across Ulthuan, learning about the webway, the network of stones that the High Elves had set up, corrupting them and using them to his advantage. And as those stones get corrupted and crumble, the weaker the Vortex get, the less stable it gets, and the less it's able to keep magic and those forces of chaos in check. So just even the throws and marches of time will be a problem to those different standing stones, to the stability of the Great Vortex, especially as fewer and fewer and fewer elven mages remember what their purpose was, or even how to care for them. And as another side note, just look at that. Look at all those knights. Like, again, if this were open field, we'd be toast, but because we have this wall, and because I understand why, but at the same time it's a little funny, because the knights can't actually dismount, they can't scale those walls and cause problems for us, so it makes things so much easier in a lot of ways. And sure, maybe it's cheesing the game a little bit, but I'm playing on hard. It's not very hard, but still, I'm playing on hard mode, so I am going to take advantage of this as much as possible, especially with as much as they're throwing at me, because this is just the first army. There's another one coming in to back them up, and they have a trebuchet and about 3 or 4 hero units along with another lord, so that's a lot of A lot of oomph, a lot of punch that they're packing there. And the magic that they do begin throwing around is just enough to disrupt and make a mess of many, 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 many different things. So, yeah, this was a fun one, though. This was a fun one to get to do. I was thinking about quitting and heading to bed earlier at this time, but I thought, let's fight it out and see what happens. And it ended up being great. And as soon as my slow ass stops, finishes getting things deployed there, it takes so much time to think about this. I mean, it's good, but at the same time, watching it, man, I can understand if some of you just kind of get bored or frustrated or don't really pay attention as and make this as more of a background noise kind of thing while I go about doing this. Still, I doubt this is a bad point to start learning at if you're wanting to play any of the Total War Warhammer games, especially now that Warhammer 3 is out. Which I actually do have, I just haven't loaded it onto my poor laptop yet, because I don't have the space for it and Warhammer 2, and I don't want to end this campaign yet, and Warhammer 3 does not quite have Immortal Empires out yet. They will soon, but hopefully things keep going well with this new job and we get caught up on bills and whatnot, all those wonderful adulting things. I will let's see about getting a new computer, something that will let me run those games and be able to keep doing stuff like this. Oh, come on, past me, hurry up. We are ready to go. We want to see the action already. Also, this does make kind of for me at least, a funny thing kind of happen in my head of where these Bretonnian knights are, oh no, chivalry demands we allow them to prepare themselves. We cannot just charge all willy-nilly with no regard for the rules. I apologize for that cheesy faux French accent. But it's a funny thought, funny image, and funny times. And that's what 3 days of only 5 hours sleep each does to you. Makes you sleepy, especially once that melatonin kicks in. I'll definitely be looking forward to getting a little bit of rest. Though I've got to put some slides together for the Cavalier episode. Make sure all of that keeps going and running along efficiently. Okay, we should be almost ready here. What am I waiting on? Oh yeah, my deck droppers and my Mongols. Layered defense. Defense in depth. Bears gonna spread themselves out wide, but I can leave few numbers up there and be ready to go. And I have those towers activated to be throwing out some very lethal, very dangerous shots at them. And I'm getting my artillery going. That lord on his Pegasus, man, if he had just gone in and started disrupting things at the back, that would have made this a bit spicier of a fight. But as it is, my poor computer trying to process all of these units moving, all the firing happening. Anyway, look at that. Look at that damage done to questing knights already. And these are questing knights with a significant amount of veterancy stacked on them. Probably a bunch of it just from recruiting, but also... Oh, that was a bad shot. All damn near right into the gate. I'm lucky it didn't hit my units or go into the gate there. If I had been paying attention and moving faster, I could have thrown those bloated corpses out there and really messed these guys up a lot faster. But, c'est la vie. look at that. We are opening up. We are unleashing shot after shot. Caged bat after caged bat from those towers. I just love the idea that those towers are just firing out swarms of caged bats. Oh, man. Here we go. Those ranged attackers. About the only real significant threat to my handgunners on the walls there. And even then, the walls are going to help diminish some of the damage that could otherwise be done. And while the cavalry archers are still a good unit, great skirmishing unit, they tend to not have quite the same massed volumes of firepower that other ranged units have. Like, for example, my handgunners, 90 models in each unit. They all have arquebuses. That's a significant amount of firepower, whereas those cavalry archers, those have 45 units. So half as many attacks that they're able to throw out there. The big advantage is their mobility, their ability to skirmish. You set them on skirmish mode, they'll keep moving, and then you can get them repositioned to shoot. And if you can split them off and divide up which ways the enemy are going, you can move, shoot, move, shoot, move, shoot, and really whittle them down and get some good value out of them. And if you're ever playing in multiplayer, or even heck against the computer, they can be a little bit more of a set and forget kind of unit because of that mobility. You don't have to worry them being caught out like you do other units. Like, they can't be run down quite so easily like archers and handgunners, and frankly, most other ranged units can be. So they can work really well in that regard. Unit wiped out. That was one of my bloated corpses. Those damned Pegasus Knights came flying in and landed to take out the corpse, and in the process ended up taking a ton of damage. I mean, look at that. They still have most of their number there, but they're now starting to fall out of the sky as my handgunners and cannons begin firing into them. And then they charge my lord, which, man, and straight up fight, had they not taken that much damage, they probably could have taken her out. But now, they're just going to get shredded. They did get shredded. And things are about to get worse for Bretonnia. I mean, look at how badly mauled and mangled these forces are. There's a fresh wave coming up, but we have munitions to spare. And they are beginning to clump up and cluster in ways that are very advantageous for me. Absolutely fantastic when that happens. Okay. Let's see what happens here. These poor peasant infantry, and they're going up against Depth Guard. Dual axe berserker infantry. Elite infantry at that, with anti-infantry and anti-infantry, the frenzying effects and all of that. These poor peasants don't really stand much of a chance. Maybe the foot squires would. And their foot squires are anti-infantry and armor piercing as well, so they could actually do a decent job against the depth guard. But it's just not a fight I'm going to allow happen or allow to be fair, even close. Oh, there go my deck droppers, getting attacked by peasant archers with flame arrows. Flame arrows definitely a good choice, especially in the Warhammer world where so many monsters are vulnerable to fire. Like, trolls, the different tree spirits like dryads and the like. And they do have to worry about dryads being so close to some major wild elf forests and the like. So they definitely need to make use of heavy use of fire attacks. Then of course Bright Order wizards, those tapped into the winds of magic that produce fire, and they do wonders against some of the more horrible things of the world. A burning head just rolling along and just screaming out with fiery hatred, just consuming everything in its path as it begins rolling along. Do so much damage with that spell once you aim it right. Though you do have to kind of be careful with how those particular spells go along.
Your orders, thine will be done.
Yeah, we're getting nearly there. That balance of power is shifting along pretty hard. It's got a couple of minutes left before this really swings back back my way, even more my way. All those different units getting ready to rout. What a bloody mess. I really should start adding gunnery wights to some of my armies. They have an ability that lets them restore ammunition. They provide more gunpowder, basically. Gunpowder and shot to keep the good times rolling. And for defensive battles like this, that would be massively invaluable, because you can see my mortars are damn near out of ammunition. My cannons, not so much. My cannons don't have as much to shoot at, and they don't have many great positions to shoot from. Those Pegasus Knights and that Lord on the Pegasus was definitely helpful in that regard, but being able to use a gunnery wight to restore the munitions of my mortars would just make this so much more terrifying. It wouldn't matter if they had a third army at that point, because with the minimal ammunition usage, all four of my towers going and firing into them, with a gunnery wight to restore the ammunition of my mortars, we could probably take 3 stacks at this fort. And if once the fort gets more upgraded, more developed, and better defended, better towers, I probably barely need an army here, but I throw an army into it, and things will get messy real fast. But delightfully so. Oh, come on, Bretonia, break and retreat already. My eyelids are starting to get heavy, and I have work in the morning. Okay. Really starting to swing that balance of power. And all those Bretonnian units that are breaking. They're breaking in the best ways possible. And it's at this point that I realize, oh, my gate broke open finally. They're finally in. So I start dedicating more units to it. And thank goodness I had those Prometheans in the way. They're a great shielding unit. I mean, look at the held up 3 units of knights. Granted, injured and not doing great, but still held them up long enough for me to realize, oh, hey, I'm in danger, and starting to throw things into the fight there to hold them back. And look at, here we go, zooming on in. All those questing knights. All of them pouring in through the gap, through those gates. A flood of gallantry and violence, of chivalry and killing power. And the tide of undead are holding them back. These questing knights break themselves upon the formations of shells and rotting flesh. Undead rotting halberdiers come in with rusty weapons and fine steels, reaching over the tops of these crustaceans, and they begin stabbing violently at the mounts, at the riders, some tearing them free from their saddles and then finishing them on the ground, ripping away visors and helmets to plunge rusted, salt-corroded weapons deep into their faces. Definitely a terrible thing, a terrible way to go, and here we go, doing more damage to them as they flee, or at least trying to. Our towers happily shooting them in the back. My deck droppers flying out to maybe, hopefully, try to catch a few more, but really, at the end here, we're going to end up calling it pretty quick, because there's only so much that we can do. And there we go. Close victory. And I was astounded by this being a close victory, because look at that. Look at that. Look at my face. And then look at that. 19 and 12. 31 losses against their 1,500 and something. 31 dead. And it's a close victory. Is it because they battered down the gates? That was always going to happen. I mean, it's just staggering and kind of dumb. I mean, yeah, I lost a bloated corpse, possibly two.
Change them for plunder.
But, man, that's a close victory. That's a victory that should be damn near heroic, given how badly we were outnumbered. Okay, we weren't super badly outnumbered, and we had walls and towers. But still, this was not a little piddly force that could be disregarded so easily out of hand. No, this was a significant dedication of Knights of Bretonnia, descending down on Fort Bergbus to seize it from us. And we held them off. That should have at least been a decisive victory, because that was pretty damn decisive. I mean, that one unit of handgunners, 130 kills. Who knows how much the garrison actually ended up racking up? I'm still willing to bet it was significant. Yeah, we are going to be wrapping things up here in a moment, because that went exceedingly well. I think we're just figuring out what it is we're going to do, seeing if maybe we could save that replay. We cannot. And, man, it doesn't feel great forgetting some of these replays. We'll take that regeneration, if I'm not mistaken. No, we took the loot. Huh.
True queen of the sea.
Alright, well, that's us done then. We're about to wrap this up here. I hope you enjoyed yourselves today. I know I had fun covering a lot of the history, but remember, if you're new here to the channel, go on down there, hit the subscribe button, or if you've already done that, go down to hit like and share, and leave your thoughts and comments down below. Did you like this playthrough? Are you enjoying all of this so far? And leave comments down below if you want to rename any of these units, and we will pick back up very soon with some very awesome fights. We're going to start things off with the Barrow Legion Rebels next time around. Remember that I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. Thank you all so much for your time, and you all have yourselves a good night.